All right, well, welcome back to our study called Sign of the Covenant. We're looking at Genesis here. We're looking at Genesis chapter 17 specifically and verse 9 today. So we're only going to focus in on verse 9. And we're going to look at how Abraham responds to God's graciousness. That's what this is all about today. Action and response to grace. All right, let's begin. First, we see God acts. As we look at verse 9, we need to remember what we looked at in the previous passage. All right, this is all tied together. This all an encounter with God. And even though we were breaking it up over a couple of weeks, we got to remember that this is one appearance of God. And actually, verse 17 goes into 18, goes into 19. So you kind of have to take everything together. But we want to remember that we looked at the first part of 17 already. So God has told Abraham all that he would do. The repetition of I will and I shall should have impressed upon Abraham and should remind us too the truth that God is gracious. God has entered into a covenant relationship with Abraham. But for what reason? Is there a reason? Well, there is no other reason than the graciousness of God. See, God did not have to bless Abraham. He didn't have to do that. He's not required to bless people. Regardless of what other people think, the Bible makes it clear he doesn't have to bless people. Okay, and did God have to count Abraham's faith as righteousness? Well, no, he didn't. He did not have to count his faith as righteousness, but he did. He did not have to withhold his wrath from Abraham. He could have punished Abraham for his sins. Abraham sinned, he should die. That's justice. But God withheld that. He was merciful towards Abraham. Abraham really deserved none of what he received. I mean, what did he receive that he deserved? Really nothing. Abraham deserved to spend eternity in hell, just like all the rest of us evildoers. That is what he earned. Remember? So, God has given Abraham unmerited favor. He didn't earn it. That's what grace is, unmerited favor. But when God gives his grace, there is a response that is demanded. So now we see Abraham responds in verse 9. So we've seen the I will from God, but now we see in verse 9 a change in the wording here. God has turned from I will, now he says, you will. So a lot of it is, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to do, I will, this shall happen, this shall happen. Then we get to verse 9, and finally we get to the place where God says, now you will. Even though God has entered into this relationship with Abraham by grace alone, it is a relationship. There are two sides to every relationship. Now, in this relationship, God has placed several commands, including the one from this passage before Abraham. Remember, we already talked about how Abraham was to walk before God and to be blameless. So here's another command from God. Notice that the commands are not about making God feel good about himself. A lot of people talk like that. It's like, well, God really wants you to worship him. God commands things not for himself. They're always it's not to make himself feel good or because he needs to be puffed up or something like that. That's not how God operates. They're not so that God gets something that he doesn't already have. Correct? What does he not have? He has everything. So the demands of this covenant, and in fact all of God's commands, are gracious. They're unmerited favor. The command of God is a favor to people. The commands of God are for the good of the recipient, not for the benefit of God. This ought to change how we view the commands of God. The demands and commands of God are not a burden or a curse upon us, but a blessing. That's what the commands of God are. I mean, read Psalm 119. Psalm 119 is a very long testimony to this fact. That's what Psalm 119 is all about, is that idea that God's law, his precepts, everything is good for us. That's what it says. Over and over again, that psalm repeats that the laws, the commands, the testimonies, statutes, precepts are a blessing. They're wondrous. They're delightful. They're counselors for us. They give us strength. They're worth more than riches. It's in themselves, they are life. And it goes on and on and on. So the demands that God places upon us as people are not to ruin our lives, but to bring true life. For example, take the command that sex is reserved for the marriage between one biological man and one biological woman. This is not a command designed to rob you of your fun or tell you that you can't love someone. I'm really sick of the world saying that all the time. It's nonsense. It's complete foolishness. It just, well, you can't tell me I can't love someone. Who's telling you can't love someone? God didn't say you couldn't love someone that's just like you, or it just blows my mind. Why'd they latch on to that? Because the Bible doesn't say that. God did put commands on how you express your sexual relationships with people. Yes, he did, and he has the right to do that. But why did he do that? Not so you'd be like, oh man, I can't believe he told me I can't do that. It's so that you would be blessed, that you would have a great life. He's saying that there's something better than what you're trying to settle for. He's saying that, that kind of relationship, that part of humanity is reserved for something that is what he wants it for, and it's good and it's a blessing. But if you go outside of that, it's not going to be a blessing. It's not going to be good for you. It's going to lead to hardship and ruin. It's going to lead you further away from God, and that kind of and the sexual relationship, the sexual act is not the height of blessing, the height of pleasure. It's not the height of all that you want. That's what God is saying. He's saying if you just settle for that, then you're really settling for something that's kind of, yeah, it's a great thing. It's an amazing thing, but you're really settling. Because what I have in my right hand are pleasures beyond comprehension. You can't even begin to understand. You can't even begin to comprehend what I have for you. So if you wanted to settle for, those kind of relationships, those are an abomination in my sight. That having sex outside of marriage, outside of a man and a woman, biologically a man and woman, if you want to settle for that, then you're settling for something that's not as good as you could have if you were to engage in that as a biological man and a biological woman who are married. He's saying that's the best. This over here, that's not what I want. I don't want you to settle for that. I want you to seek the greatest thing. And then even beyond that, he's like, I don't even want you to settle for between man and woman at biological marriage. He wants the best marriage. And then he doesn't want just the best marriage. He's saying that the best marriage is only a picture of the relationship of Christ and his church. And so if we're just looking at these things as the height of pleasure, the height of delight, the height of the best things, then we've settled for something that's less. We've given up what God has for us, and we've gone after things that are lesser than what he has. So let's move on from there, because I could talk all day about that. All right, let's move on. The next thing is required obedience. That's what we're talking about here. So the promises of God have come to Abraham and us by grace. Okay, we don't deserve any of those. We don't deserve the commands and promises of God. But this is not easy believism that we're talking about here, correct? It's not, well, you just believe and you get to go to heaven. You just believe you get all the good stuff. No, there are, within the covenant of God, there are requirements, there are duties, there are responses that need to come because of God's grace. There's required obedience. So, though salvation comes by grace through faith alone, a part of that salvation is sanctification and the daily struggle against sin and the striving for obedience. See, that is a piece of salvation. You've been saved by grace through faith, but part of that salvation, part of what comes with salvation is obedience to God. Part of that comes with doing what God said. So if you say, well, I'm saved and I love Jesus Christ, well, that means, like what John said in 1 John, you have to do what Jesus commands. Those go together. You can't separate those two. So it's not an easy believism, like you get saved and you can do whatever you want. God saves you and then you can live whatever life you want to live. Those two don't go together. If you believe you're saved and you believe you can do whatever you want, then you're not saved. That's what John tells us. So, for Abraham, he received the grace, he received the promises, he received the commands, and he needs to respond. But you know what? The commands aren't just for him, they're generational commands. Because God told Abraham that he was to keep the covenant with God, but not just him, but his offspring as well through their generations. This was not a one and done kind of deal here, but a lifelong and then even generational long, everlasting commitment to God and what he has called Abraham and us to be. The main idea of this passage is not about the sign of the covenant, really. It's not about the sign itself, which we'll talk about in the next study, but it's about loyalty to God. Keep my covenant, he says. Keep this relationship between us. That's what he's talking about. And then he'll show the sign, which is circumcision, which is the way he is to keep the covenant, that relationship between them. But he's saying, the main point, the main idea is to keep that between them. Not to give up the relationship with God, not to walk away from God. But it's talking about loyalty to God. And that loyalty goes beyond even Abraham's life into his descendants' life. So that's the end of this study today. Hopefully you got something out of that rambling that I've done. But the idea is that God's commands are gracious to us. And when we follow God's commands, we get blessed. That's just how it works. That's how God set it up.